Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on something special. A full 2-hour journey through one of history's most incredible reversals of fortune. The story of the only tribe that made the mighty Vikings turn and run in absolute terror. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to settle yourself comfortably. Adjust your pillow. Pull your blanket a little higher. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. We have time. All the time you need. Picture yourself standing on the deck of a Viking longship. The year is around 1000. The Atlantic wind cuts through your wool cloak as the wooden vessel rocks beneath your feet. You have sailed for weeks across waters that most people believe lead to the edge of the world. Your crew of hardened warriors surrounds you. These are men who have raided monasteries across England, men who have conquered half of Ireland, men whose very name makes kings tremble and peasants flee their villages. And yet something waits ahead that will shake even their iron courage to its very core. So before you get comfortable, and I mean really comfortable because we are in for the long haul, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I see you. 3 in the morning squad. For those using this for sleep, I have designed the pacing to gradually slow over our 2 hours together. Hour 1 will keep you engaged. And by hour 2, well, sweet dreams. Now dim those lights. Set your sleep timer if you are wise. Maybe turn on that fan for white noise. And let us ease into tonight's marathon journey together. To understand why this particular tribe terrified the Vikings, you first need to understand just how fearsome the Vikings themselves were. We are talking about a civilization that produced some of the most capable warriors the world has ever seen. From roughly the late 700s to the early 1100s, the Norse people of Scandinavia unleashed a wave of exploration, trade, and conquest that reshaped the entire map of Europe. Think about what that means for a moment. While most medieval Europeans rarely traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, Viking ships were crossing thousands of miles of open ocean. Their navigation skills were extraordinary. They could read the stars, the flight patterns of birds, the color of the water, and even the behavior of whales to find their way across seemingly endless seas. Now, here is something that might surprise you. The popular image of Vikings as nothing but bloodthirsty raiders is actually quite incomplete. Yes, they certainly earned their fearsome reputation through brutal attacks on coastal settlements. The famous raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 shocked all of Christian Europe. But Vikings were also traders, farmers, craftsmen, and explorers. They established trade routes that stretched from Baghdad to Newfoundland. They founded cities like Dublin and Kiev. Their influence shaped the development of Russia, England, France, and many other nations. But tonight, we focus on a different side of Viking history. The side where these legendary warriors encountered something they simply could not understand or defeat. A people so fierce, so alien to everything the Norse knew, that even the bravest among them counseled retreat. You settle into your position on the ship as we begin this journey. The wood creaks beneath you. Somewhere a sailor is humming an old Norse saga. The rhythm of the oars provides a steady heartbeat to our tale. Let yourself drift into this world of 1,000 years ago, when the boundaries of the known world were still being drawn. The Vikings called themselves Norsemen, which simply means people of the north. They came primarily from 3 regions we now know as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Each region developed its own particular specialty in the wider Viking world. The Danes focused much of their attention on England and the Frankish kingdoms. The Swedes, often called Varangians, pushed east into what would become Russia. And the Norwegians, well, they became the great Atlantic explorers. It is the Norwegians who concern us most tonight. These were the sailors who discovered and settled Iceland around 870. From Iceland, they pushed even further west, establishing settlements in Greenland around 985 under the leadership of a red-haired outlaw named Eric. Eric the Red, as history remembers him, was actually exiled from Iceland for killing several men in a dispute. His solution was to sail west and find new land. Greenland was not exactly green, of course. Eric gave it that name partly as what we might call today a marketing strategy. He wanted other Norse settlers to follow him, and calling the place Greenland sounded more appealing than calling it what it actually was, which was a massive island mostly covered in ice. But the Norse made it work. They established two main settlement areas along the southwestern coast where the climate was somewhat milder. At its peak, the Greenland colony may have had around 5,000 inhabitants. They raised sheep and cattle. They hunted seals and walrus. They traded valuable goods like walrus ivory back to Europe. And then, around the year 1000, they went even further west. This is where our story truly begins. You feel the ship surge forward as the wind catches the square sail. The horizon stretches endlessly before you. Somewhere out there lies a land the Norse will call Vinland, a land of wild grapes and thick forests, a land that holds both incredible promise and unimaginable danger. The first European to sight the North American mainland was likely a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, which is pronounced roughly as Bjarni Herjolfsson. Around 986, Bjarni was sailing from Iceland to visit his father in the new Greenland settlements. He got blown off course by storms and spotted an unfamiliar coastline. But Bjarni was not an explorer by nature. He simply noted the sighting and continued on to Greenland without ever going ashore. It would be another man who took that fateful step onto the New World's beaches. A man whose encounter with the natives would send shockwaves through the entire Norse world. His name was Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson was the son of Eric the Red, which meant he came from a family that was basically Norse royalty in the Greenland settlements. His father had founded the colony. His family controlled much of the best farmland. Young Leif grew up hearing tales of exploration and adventure. The discovery of new lands was practically in his blood. Around the year 1000, Leif decided to investigate those mysterious lands that Bjarni Herjolfsson had spotted. He bought Bjarni's ship, assembled a crew of 35 men, and set sail westward into the unknown. You can imagine the mixture of excitement and apprehension that must have filled that vessel. These men were venturing beyond any map, beyond any saga, into waters where no Norse ship had ever deliberately traveled. You are aboard that ship now. Feel the salt spray on your face. Hear the snap of the sail in the Arctic wind. The men around you are checking their weapons almost unconsciously. Swords, axes, awes. Even on a voyage of exploration, Vikings traveled prepared for battle. It was simply their way. Leif's expedition made several landfalls along the North American coast. The first area they encountered was rocky and barren. Leif called it Helluland, meaning flat stone land. This was probably the coast of Baffin Island. Not particularly impressive, but the crew was excited simply to have found land at all. Continuing south, they reached a heavily forested coastline. Leif named this Markland, meaning forest land. This was likely the coast of Labrador. The timber here was magnificent. Remember, Greenland had almost no trees. The Norse settlers there had to import all their building wood from incredible distance. Finding a land with abundant forests was like discovering a gold mine. But Leif pressed on. Something drew him further south. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Perhaps it was some instinct that told him better lands lay ahead. Whatever the reason, the expedition continued down the coast until they reached a place that seemed almost magical to Norse eyes. They found a region where the climate was mild. The rivers teemed with fish, and wild grapes grew in abundance. Leif named this place Vinland, meaning wine land. The exact location of Vinland has been debated by historians for centuries. Some place it in Newfoundland, where archaeologists have found definite evidence of Norse settlement. Others argue for locations further south, perhaps New England, or even the mid-Atlantic coast. What we know for certain is that Leif and his crew spent the winter there. They built temporary shelters, which the sagas call booths. They explored the surrounding countryside. They gathered timber and grapes to bring back to Greenland. And perhaps most importantly, they encountered the native inhabitants of this new land. The Norse called these people Skraelings, which is pronounced Skraelings. The exact meaning of this word is debated. It might mean screechers, referring to the sounds of an unfamiliar language. It might mean wretched ones, which would reflect Norse arrogance toward anyone who was not Norse. Or it might simply mean foreigner in a general sense. Whatever its precise meaning, it was the term the Norse would use for all the indigenous peoples they encountered in North America. Now here is where things get interesting for our story. Leif's initial expedition apparently did not have significant contact with the Skraelings. The sagas mention that his crew saw signs of habitation and glimpsed the natives from a distance, but there was no major interaction. Leif returned to Greenland with tales of abundant resources and a climate far milder than anything in the Norse Atlantic settlements. His stories ignited a fever of interest. Vinland became the talk of the Greenland colony. Here was a land of plenty, seemingly ripe for the taking. Multiple expeditions would soon follow, each hoping to establish a permanent Norse presence in this new world. And each would learn a harsh lesson about the people who already called this land home. You feel the ship slow as Leif's crew prepares to return to Greenland. The hold is filled with timber and dried grapes. The men are in high spirits. They have discovered something remarkable and live to tell of it. They have no idea that they have also set in motion a chain of events that will end in terror and retreat. After Leif's successful voyage, his brother Thorvald organized the next major expedition. This would be the first to have substantial contact with the Skraelings, and it would not go well. Thorvald sailed with a crew of around 30 men. They found Leif's old camp and used it as their base of operations. For 2 years they explored the coastline, mapping bays and peninsulas, looking for the ideal site for a permanent settlement. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. Then came the encounter that changed everything. The saga describes it simply but vividly. Thorvald's crew was exploring a headland when they spotted 3 small mounds on the beach. As they approached, they realized the mounds were actually skin boats, what we would now call kayaks, turned upside down. Under each boat, 3 men were sleeping, 9 Skraelings in total. What happened next reveals much about the Viking mindset. Without any provocation, without any attempt at communication, Thorvald ordered his men to attack. 8 of the 9 Skraelings were killed. 1 managed to escape in his kayak, paddling frantically toward the interior. You can almost see it happening. The morning sun on the water, the quiet beach, and then sudden violence. Blood on the sand. Bodies sprawled beneath overturned boats. And 1 lone survivor, paddling with desperate strength, carrying news of the attack to his people. The Vikings seem to have thought nothing of what they had done. They returned to their camp, ate their dinner, and went to sleep. But later that day, they received a wake-up call unlike anything in their experience. A fleet of skin boats appeared in the bay. The sagas say the boats were so numerous, they looked like a swarm of insects on the water. Each boat carried armed warriors. The Skraelings had come for revenge. What followed was the first real battle between Europeans and Native Americans. Arrows darkened the sky. The Norse raised their shields and fought back with their own bows. The battle raged for hours, and when it was over, Thorvald Eriksson lay dying. An arrow had found the gap between his shield and his armor, striking him in the armpit. His last words, according to the saga, were instructions to bury him in Vinland, with a cross at his head and feet. Then he died. The first recorded European casualty in the Americas. The death of Thorvald Eriksson sent shockwaves through the Greenland Norse community. Here was a proven warrior, son of Eric the Red himself, killed by people that most Europeans had never even heard of. The Skraelings had proven they were not simply primitive savages to be brushed aside. They were dangerous, they were organized, and they clearly did not appreciate uninvited guests. But the Norse were not easily discouraged. The lure of Vinland remained strong. The timber, the grapes, the milder climate, all of these things beckoned to a people living on the harsh edge of the Arctic. Surely, they reasoned, with better preparation and larger numbers, they could establish a permanent foothold in this new land. The next major expedition was organized by a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni, pronounced roughly as Thorfinn Karlsefni. His was the most ambitious attempt yet to colonize Vinland. He gathered between 60 and 160 people, depending on which version of the saga you read. More significantly, this expedition included women and livestock. This was not a raiding party or an exploration crew. This was a genuine colonization effort. You are among those colonists now. Picture yourself standing on a Greenland dock, watching sheep and cattle being loaded onto longships. Women are saying goodbye to families who will remain behind. Children are running underfoot, excited and terrified in equal measure. Everyone knows the stories about Thorvald's death. Everyone knows about the Skraelings. But the hope of a better life drives them forward. Thorfinn's expedition established a settlement they called Straumfjord, which means stream fjord. They built proper houses, not just the temporary booths of earlier expeditions. They planted crops. They let their livestock graze on the rich grasslands. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Norse dream of Vinland might actually succeed. And then the Skraelings came. The first contact was peaceful. A group of natives appeared near the settlement, curious about these strange newcomers. The Norse were cautious, but not hostile. Perhaps they had learned something from Thorvald's fatal mistake. Instead of attacking, they attempted trade. The Skraelings were particularly interested in dairy products, something that did not exist in their Ehon culture. They traded valuable furs for milk. Both sides seemed satisfied with the arrangement. The natives departed peacefully, promising to return for more trade. Here is something fascinating to consider. This was genuine first contact between two completely isolated branches of humanity. The ancestors of these Native Americans had crossed from Asia thousands of years earlier. Since then, they had developed in complete isolation from the rest of the world. Their languages, their tools, their beliefs, their entire way of life had evolved along a completely separate path. And now, here they stood, face to face with people from an entirely different world. Can you imagine what each side must have thought of the other? The Norse, with their iron weapons, their woolen clothing, their massive ships. To native eyes, they must have seemed almost supernatural. And the Skraelings, with their skin boats, their unfamiliar appearance, their completely alien culture. To Norse eyes, they were utterly mysterious. But here is the thing that really matters for our story. Despite all their advantages in technology and weaponry, the Norse were about to discover that these mysterious people were absolutely terrifying in battle. The trading relationship continued for several weeks. The Skraelings returned multiple times, always peaceful, always eager to trade furs for milk and cloth. But tensions were building beneath the surface. The Norse noticed that the native groups were growing larger with each visit. More warriors, more boats, more eyes watching the settlement. Then one of the Norse bulls, a massive animal that the colonists had brought from Greenland, broke loose from its enclosure. It charged out of the woods, bellowing with that deep, thunderous roar that only a bull can produce. The Skraelings had never seen or heard anything like it. To them, this giant, snorting beast must have seemed like something from a nightmare. They panicked. They fled in their boats, paddling away as fast as they could. The trade session ended in chaos and fear. You might think this incident would have favored the Norse. After all, their livestock had scared away the natives. But it actually had the opposite effect. The Skraelings interpreted the bull's appearance as some kind of attack. They believed the Norse had deliberately released the beast to frighten them. Whatever fragile trust had been building between the two groups was shattered. 3 weeks later, a vast fleet of skin boats appeared on the water. The sagas say it was the largest group of Skraelings anyone had seen. They were not coming to trade. This is where we need to talk about one of the most mysterious and terrifying weapons in this entire story. The Skraelings brought something that the Norse had never encountered before, something that still puzzles historians today. The sagas describe it in vivid terms. The Skraelings carried a large sphere on a pole. The sphere was dark-colored, about the size of a sheep's belly. When the battle began, they launched this sphere from the pole into the air. It flew over the Norse lines and landed among the defenders. And then something happened. Something that made hardened Viking warriors break and run. The saga says the sphere made a horrible noise. Not the noise of an explosion or an immusis, but something else. Something that struck pure terror into the hearts of men who had never feared anything before. The Norse broke ranks. For perhaps the first time in recorded Viking history, a group of Norse warriors fled in genuine panic from an enemy. They ran into the woods, abandoning their defensive positions, abandoning their settlement, abandoning everything they had built. What was this mysterious weapon? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some suggest it was a primitive catapult, hurling stones wrapped in animal bladders. Others propose it was a psychological weapon, designed to terrify rather than kill, perhaps making sounds that seemed supernatural to Norse ears. Still others wonder if the Skraelings possessed some form of early explosive or incendiary device. Whatever it was, it worked. The mighty Vikings ran. The panic among the Norse warriors is difficult to overstate. These were not ordinary men. They came from a culture that valued courage above almost anything else. The worst insult you could give a Norseman was to call him a coward. Their entire society was built around the warrior ideal. Their religion promised that the bravest warriors would feast in Valhalla after death. Dying in battle was the highest honor. And yet these same warriors were now running through the forest, terrified by a weapon they could not understand. The sagas tell us that the men fled so quickly they barely looked back. They abandoned their shields, their supplies, their carefully built defenses. Raw, primal fear had overcome centuries of warrior culture. You are fleeing with them now. Your heart pounds in your chest. Branches whip against your face as you run. Behind you, the strange sounds of the Skraeling weapon still echo in your ears. Around you, men you thought were fearless are gasping with terror. What kind of magic is this? What kind of people possess such power? But the Norse retreat was about to be stopped by perhaps the most remarkable figure in this entire story. Her name was Freydis Eriksdottir, which is pronounced Freydays Eriksdottir. She was the illegitimate daughter of Eric the Red, making her Leif Eriksson's half-sister. And she was pregnant at the time of the attack. Freydis saw the men running and was filled with disgust. The saga quotes her as shouting at them, demanding to know why they were fleeing from such wretched opponents. She said that if she had a weapon, she would fight better than any of them. Then she did something extraordinary. Unable to run because of her pregnancy, Fridas picked up a sword from a fallen warrior. She faced the advancing Skraelings alone. And then, in a moment that has puzzled and fascinated historians for 1,000 years, she pulled down the top of her dress, exposed her breast, and slapped the flat of the sword against it. The Skraelings stopped. Just as suddenly as they had attacked, they retreated. They returned to their boats and paddled away. The battle was over. What are we to make of this bizarre scene? Why would baring a breast stop a group of warriors in the middle of a successful attack? Scholars have proposed various theories. Some suggest that the Skraelings interpreted Fridas's action as some kind of supernatural display. In many cultures, unusual behavior during battle was seen as a sign of otherworldly power. Perhaps they believed she was performing some kind of dangerous magic. Others point out that many Native American cultures had taboos about attacking pregnant women. Perhaps the sight of Fridas's swollen belly gave them pause, and her strange gesture emphasized her condition. Still, others argue that the Skraelings simply decided they had achieved their objective. They had successfully driven the Norse from their positions. They had proven their dominance. There was no need for further bloodshed. Whatever the reason, Fridas's courage had saved the colony from immediate destruction. But the damage was done. The Norse had seen their mighty warriors break and run. They had witnessed a weapon they could not understand or counter. The dream of Vinland was dying. Let us pause here to consider something important. We have been telling this story primarily from the Norse perspective, because that is where our written sources come from. The sagas were composed by Norse writers, preserving Norse memories. But there is another side to this story that we should not forget. The people the Norse called Skraelings were not primitive savages. They were sophisticated peoples who had lived in North America for thousands of years. They had developed technologies perfectly adapted to their environment. Their skin boats were marvels of engineering, capable of navigating waters that would have swamped European vessels. Their hunting techniques allowed them to thrive in some of the harshest climates on Earth. Their social structures and cultural practices were complex and meaningful. From their perspective, the Norse were the invaders. Strange men had arrived in large wooden ships, carrying weapons of metal that the native people had never seen. These strangers had killed sleeping men on a beach without provocation. They had tried to settle on lands that belonged to other peoples. The Skraeling attacks were not unprovoked aggression. They were self-defense against colonial invasion. This is a pattern that would repeat countless times over the following centuries as Europeans pushed into the Americas. And in almost every case, the indigenous peoples would eventually lose. But here, in Vinland around the year 1000, they won. They drove the invaders back to the sea. After the attack, Thorfinn Karlsefni made the difficult decision to abandon the Vinland colony. The sagas say that he realized they would never be able to live in peace with the Skraelings. Even if they won every battle, there would always be more natives. The Norse would always be vastly outnumbered in a hostile land. Think about what this means. The Vikings had conquered half of England. They had established kingdoms in Ireland. They had fought their way from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. And yet they could not hold a settlement against the indigenous people of North America. You stand on the shore now, watching the ships being loaded for the voyage back to Greenland. Children are crying. Animals are being herded into holds. Women are taking last looks at the homes they will never see again. The great experiment is over. Vinland will remain a land of dream and memory, not of Norse settlement. But wait, there is something else you should know. Something that makes this story even more remarkable. The Norse did not encounter just one group of native people in North America. And the group that terrified them the most was not even the same people who attacked Thorfinn's settlement. To understand what truly terrified the Vikings, we need to look at the broader picture of who actually lived in North America during this period. The Norse encounters with native peoples happened across a vast stretch of coastline, from the Arctic regions of Baffin Island down to areas that might have been as far south as New England. Different groups of indigenous peoples inhabited these regions, and each had their own relationship with the Norse intruders. In the far north, the Norse encountered a people they also called Skraelings, but who were actually quite different from the groups further south. These were the ancestors of the Inuit, sometimes called the Thule people by archaeologists. And here is where our story takes its most dramatic turn. You see, the Thule people were expanding during exactly the same period that the Norse were trying to establish themselves in the North Atlantic. Starting from their original homeland in Alaska, the Thule were spreading eastward across the Arctic. They reached Greenland around the same time that the Norse were settling there, and they were, quite simply, better adapted to Arctic survival than the Vikings could ever be. Now let yourself imagine being a Norse settler in Greenland. You have worked incredibly hard to establish a farm on this harsh, treeless coast. You have built a stone house, raised sheep and cattle, and created a life for your family in one of the most challenging environments in the world. You think you know cold. You think you understand survival in the frozen north. And then you see them for the first time. Hunters in small, incredibly maneuverable boats, paddling with effortless skill through waters clogged with ice. Men who can travel across frozen seas by dog sled at speeds you cannot match. People who seem to thrive in conditions that would kill any Norseman in hours. The Thule were master hunters of sea mammals. They had developed the kayak to near perfection. Their larger boats, called umiaks, could transport entire families across open water. They had sophisticated techniques for hunting whales, seals, and walruses. Their clothing, made from carefully prepared animal skins, was far superior to Norse wool for Arctic conditions. This is a remarkable reversal of the usual pattern. In most encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples, the Europeans had significant technological advantages. They had metal weapons, ships with sails, and later firearms. But in the Arctic, the technological advantage belonged to the Thule. Their tools, their boats, their clothing, their entire way of life was more advanced for that specific environment than anything the Europeans possessed. The Norse in Greenland left multiple accounts of encounters with these northern Skraelings, and their descriptions reveal a deep and abiding fear. One saga describes Norse hunters traveling north along the Greenland coast in search of walrus and seals. They came upon an abandoned Skraeling camp. The sight fascinated and disturbed them. They found strange tools made from bone and ivory. They found remains of meals that suggested hunting techniques far beyond their own. They found evidence of a people who could survive and even thrive in the deepest Arctic. The hunters hurried back south. They reported that these Skraelings were like nothing they had ever seen. These were not the same people they had encountered in Vinland. These northern Skraelings seemed almost supernatural in their ability to survive the cold. Here is something that should send a chill down your spine. In 2057, the Norse in Greenland recorded their only direct hostile encounter with the Thule. A small group of Norse hunters was killed in the northern hunting grounds. The circumstances are unclear. Perhaps it was a dispute over hunting territory. Perhaps it was retaliation for some previous offense. But the result was the same: more dead Norsemen. After that incident, the Norse largely abandoned the northern hunting grounds. They ceded that territory to the Skraelings without a fight. Think about what that means. The same people who had raided across Europe, who had besieged Paris, who had carved out kingdoms from England to Sicily, gave up their hunting grounds rather than fight these particular opponents. Why? What made the Thule so terrifying? Part of it was certainly their environmental mastery. The Norse understood that any conflict with the Thule would take place in Arctic conditions. And in those conditions, the Thule had every advantage. They could disappear into the ice and snow. They could travel faster and further. They could survive weather that would kill a Norseman. Fighting them would be like fighting ghosts. But there was something else. Something in the Norse accounts suggests a deeper, almost spiritual fear. The Thule seemed to live beyond the boundaries of the known world. They came from the north, from the direction of ultimate cold and darkness. In Norse mythology, the far north was associated with giants and monsters, with the frozen realm of Niflheim that existed before the creation of the world. You can feel that fear now. Imagine standing watch at a Norse settlement as winter darkness falls. The temperature drops until your breath freezes in your beard. The sea ice creaks and groans with otherworldly sounds. And somewhere out there, in that frozen darkness, are people who consider this weather merely routine. People who are watching you right now, perhaps, with eyes adapted to the Arctic night. The decline of the Norse Greenland colonies is one of the great mysteries of medieval history. At their peak in the 1300s, the settlements may have held over 3,000 people. They had churches, a bishop, trading connections to Europe, and all the institutions of medieval Christian society. And then, over the following centuries, they simply vanished. The last definite contact with the Greenland Norse came in 1408, when a marriage was recorded at a church in the eastern settlement. After that, silence. When Europeans finally returned to Greenland in the 1700s, they found only ruins. Empty churches with collapsed roofs, farmhouses reclaimed by the Arctic grass. No bodies, no records, just abandonment. What happened? This is where our story of the tribe that terrified the Vikings reaches its haunting conclusion. Because most historians now believe that the Thule, the northern Skraelings, played a crucial role in the end of Norse Greenland. You must understand the situation the Norse settlers faced. Their survival in Greenland depended on a delicate balance of resources. They needed pasture land for their livestock. They needed access to hunting grounds for supplemental food. They needed driftwood from the beaches for fuel and construction. And they needed trade goods to exchange with European merchants for iron, grain, and other necessities. The most valuable trade goods were walrus ivory, seal skins, and other products from the northern hunting grounds. These were the exports that connected Greenland to the wider world economy. Without them, the settlements would wither. But the Thule were expanding into exactly those hunting grounds. As their population grew, they moved further south along both coasts of Greenland. They established camps in areas the Norse had considered their own. They competed for the same seals, the same walruses, the same whales. Now, here is something crucial to understand. The Norse could not simply drive the Thule away. They tried to avoid direct conflict whenever possible. The Norse seemed to understand, on some level, that they were outmatched in this particular environment. Imagine being a Norse hunter heading north in the summer months. You need to reach the walrus herds to obtain the ivory that your community depends on. But the route takes you through waters that the Skraelings now control. Your wooden rowboat is sturdy, but slow. You see kayaks in the distance, moving with uncanny speed. Do you continue? Do you turn back? Every journey becomes a gamble with your life. This pressure on the hunting grounds was devastating to the Norse economy. Trade goods became harder to obtain. European merchants visited less frequently. The lifeline connecting Greenland to the outside world grew thinner and thinner. But it was not just economics. There is evidence that the Thule occasionally attacked Norse settlements directly. Archaeological excavations have found Norse farmsteads that appear to have been abandoned suddenly, with valuable items left behind. Some sites show signs of burning. Some contain human remains with marks of violence. One particularly haunting discovery was made at a site called Sandnes in the Western Settlement. Archaeologists found the skeleton of a Norse woman in what appeared to have been a hasty burial. Her skull showed evidence of a violent blow. Nearby were the scattered bones of cattle, horses, sheep, and goats. The animals had not been butchered for food. They had simply been killed and left. What happened at Sandnes? Was it a Thule attack? Was it something else entirely? We may never know for certain. But the pattern of sudden abandonment, of violence, of flight, appears at multiple sites throughout the Western Settlement. The Western Settlement was the first to fall. By the mid-1300s, it was completely abandoned. A Norwegian expedition that visited around 1350 found nothing but empty farms and wandering livestock. The settlers had vanished. Where did they go? Some may have tried to reach the Eastern Settlement, further south. Some may have attempted the dangerous voyage back to Iceland or Norway. And some, perhaps, did not escape at all. You are sitting now in one of those abandoned farmhouses. The fire has gone out. The livestock have wandered away. Through the gaps in the stone walls, you can see the shapes moving on the hillside. Are they people? Are they animals? In the Arctic twilight, it is impossible to tell. But you know, with a certainty that turns your blood cold, that you are no longer the master of this land. The Eastern Settlement lasted longer, but its fate was ultimately the same. The last recorded inhabitants were the ones who attended that wedding in 1408. Sometime after that, they too disappeared. Norse Greenland was finished. The Vikings, who had conquered so much of the medieval world, had finally met their match. Not in the armies of kings or the walls of great cities, but in the patient, implacable pressure of a people who simply belonged here more than they did. Let us now consider what this story tells us about the nature of power, conquest, and resilience. The Vikings were, by any measure, one of the most successful warrior peoples in medieval history. Their expansion across Europe was extraordinary. From their Scandinavian homeland, they reached Britain, Trilland, France, Sweden, Italy, Russia, the Middle East, and even Constantinople. Their reputation for ferocity was such that medieval Christians literally prayed to God for protection from the Northmen's fury. And yet in North America, they met peoples who not only resisted them, but actually drove them out. What does this tell us? First, it tells us something important about technological determinism. We often assume that the society with the better technology will always win. The group with iron defeats the group with bronze. The group with guns defeats the group with bows. But the encounters between Norse and native peoples show that technology is not everything. The Vikings had superior metallurgy. Their iron weapons could cut through bone and sinew. Their steel helmets could deflect arrows. But the native peoples had superior knowledge of the land. They knew where to find food. They knew how to travel across difficult terrain. They knew how to survive conditions that would kill a European. In many cases, they even had superior naval technology, their kayaks being far more maneuverable than Norse boats in ice-choked waters. Technology must be appropriate to its environment. A sword is useless if you freeze to death before you can swing it. Second, this story tells us about the limits of warrior culture. The Norse valued individual heroism and personal courage above almost everything. Their literature celebrates warriors who never retreat, who fight to the death, who would rather die than show fear. But this warrior ethic proved to be a weakness in some situations. The Norse could not accept that the Skraelings might simply be better fighters in this particular context. They could not adapt their tactics to deal with enemies who fought differently. When their standard approach of frontal assault and intimidation failed, they had no backup plan. The result was panic and retreat. You are a young Norse warrior, trained from childhood in the ways of your ancestors. You know how to fight in a shield wall. You know how to raid a monastery or storm a city gate. But nothing in your training has prepared you for an enemy who attacks from kayaks, disappears into the fog, and uses weapons you have never seen before. Your courage does not help you. Your sword does not help you. All your warrior traditions are suddenly useless. Third, this story tells us about demographic reality. The Norse were always vastly outnumbered in North America. At their peak, the Vinland settlements probably held no more than a few hundred people. The Greenland colonies at their largest had perhaps 5,000. But the indigenous populations numbered in the hundreds of thousands, or even millions. In Europe, the Vikings could raid and retreat, wearing down their opponents over time. But in North America, any losses they suffered were permanent. Every Norse warrior killed was a warrior who could not be replaced. The native peoples, by contrast, could absorb losses and keep fighting. Time was on their side. This is why Thorfinn Karlsefni made the decision to abandon Vinland. He realized that even if the Norse won every battle, they would eventually lose the war. There were simply too many Skrælings and too few Norse. Now let yourself drift a bit deeper into this story. The fire burns low. The night grows longer. Outside, the wind sighs through places that were once Norse and are now just empty and forgotten. Think about what the Skrælling victories meant for the future of North America. If the Norse had successfully colonized Vinland, the history of the continent might have been very different. European diseases might have reached North America 500 years before Columbus. European animals and crops might have transformed the landscape centuries earlier. The indigenous peoples might have had time to develop resistance to old world diseases before the great waves of colonization began in the 1500s. Instead, the Norse withdrawal meant that North America remained isolated for another 5 centuries. When Europeans finally returned in force, the native peoples had no immunity to diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus. The resulting epidemics killed perhaps 90% of the indigenous population. It was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. In a strange and terrible way, the Skrælling victories of the year 1000 made the native peoples more vulnerable to the European invasions of the 1500s. By keeping the Norse out, they also kept out the diseases that would have been devastating in the short term, but might have allowed time for resistance to develop. History is full of such ironies. Victories become defeats. Defeats become victories. The patterns are only visible in hindsight, and even then, they remain deeply uncertain. As we near the end of our first hour together, let us draw some final threads together. We have traveled across 1,000 years and thousands of miles. We have sailed with Leif Erikson to the shores of Vinland. We have felt the terror of the mysterious Skrælling weapon. We have watched Freydis bare her breast to stop an enemy charge. We have shivered in the Arctic darkness as the Thule expanded into Norse hunting grounds. What remains is the question of memory. How has this story been remembered? And what does it mean for us today? The Norse themselves preserved the Vinland tales in their sagas, those extraordinary works of medieval literature that combined history, legend, and storytelling into something unique. The two main accounts are the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. They tell overlapping, but sometimes contradictory versions of the same events. Scholars have debated for centuries which details are historical fact and which are literary embellishment. What is clear is that the sagas remembered the Skrælings with a mixture of fear and respect. These were not simply enemies to be dismissed. They were people who had beaten the Vikings at their own game. The saga authors seemed to understand, even if they did not fully accept, that the indigenous peoples of North America were formidable opponents. For the native peoples themselves, we have no written records from this period. Their histories were preserved through oral tradition, passed down through generations in forms that we can only partially reconstruct today. Some archaeologists have found evidence that might reflect encounters with the Norse. Certain objects made of metal or other European materials have been found at native sites far from any known Norse settlement. These might represent trade goods that passed through many hands. They might be trophies taken from fallen enemies, or they might have meanings we cannot even guess. You are drowsy now. The story has settled into your mind like snow settling on a winter landscape. Each detail finds its place. Each image connects to others in patterns both clear and half-hidden. Let me tell you one more thing before this hour ends. In 1960, archaeologists discovered a site at Lull's Meadows at the northern tip of Newfoundland. This is pronounced Lonse Meadows. What they found there was extraordinary. The remains of Norse buildings, undeniably European in style, dating to around the year 1000. Iron nails, a bronze pin, a spindle whorl indicating the presence of women. This was the proof that the sagas had been telling the truth. Vikings really had reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They really had built settlements, however temporary, on this continent. The story we have been telling tonight was not just legend. It was history. But here is the thing that strikes me most about Lonse Meadows. The site was used for only a short time, perhaps a few years at most. Then it was abandoned, carefully and deliberately, with the buildings left intact and the garbage pits filled in. The Norse walked away from Vinland and never came back. They walked away because of the Skraelings, because they encountered peoples who refused to be conquered, who fought back with skill and determination, who proved that even the mightiest warriors have limits. The only tribe that terrified the Vikings to death was not one tribe at all. It was many peoples, from the hunters of Vinland to the Thule of the Arctic, each defending their homeland against invaders from across the sea. And they won. For 500 years they won. The fire has burned down to embers. The night has grown deep and quiet. You are warm and safe, and beginning to drift toward sleep. The story will continue in our second hour, taking us deeper into the mysteries of what the Norse found and feared in the New World. But for now, rest. Rest and remember the hunters in their skin boats, watching from the fog. Remember the mysterious weapon that made warriors flee. Remember Freydis, standing alone against an army. Remember the last Norse woman at Sandnes, her skull marked with violence, her body hastily buried by hands that may have been trying to hide their work. These things happened 1,000 years ago, on shores we can still walk today. The mightiest warriors of the medieval world met their match, and the people who defeated them have descendants who still live on this continent, still remember their histories, still carry within them the legacy of those who turned back the Norse tide. The wind blows, the waves roll. Somewhere a raven calls across the water, and in the darkness between continents, the old stories continue to whisper their secrets to anyone who will listen. Let your eyes close now. The second hour waits, but there is no rush to reach it. The story will be there when you are ready. The Skraelings will still be paddling their kayaks across the cold waters. The Norse will still be loading their ships for the long voyage home. And you will be here, drifting between waking and sea-free, between the world you know and the world of 1,000 years ago. Welcome back to our journey through one of history's most remarkable reversals. You have rested well, I hope, drifting on the edges of sleep while the first hour of our tale washed over you. Now we continue, but the pace will slow. The waters grow calmer. The night grows deeper. Let yourself settle even further into comfort as we explore the mysteries that still surround the Norse encounters with the peoples of North America. Take a breath now. A slow, deep breath. Feel your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The story continues, but it asks nothing of you except to listen, to drift, to let the words carry you like a ship on gentle swells. We left off with questions. What was the mysterious weapon that the Skraelings used against the Norse? Why did hardened Viking warriors break and run from enemies they should have been able to defeat? And what really happened during those fateful years when two worlds collided on the shores of a continent that Europeans would not return to for another 5 centuries? Let us begin with the weapon. The sagas describe it in terms that have puzzled scholars for generations. A large sphere, dark in color, about the size of a sheep's stomach. It was placed on a pole and somehow launched or thrown toward the Norse defenders. When it landed, it made a terrible noise, and that noise, whatever it was, triggered panic among warriors who had never known fear before. You can imagine the scene unfolding in slow motion. The Skraeling warriors gathering on the shore. The Norse forming their defensive line, shields raised, weapons ready. They have done this before, these Norsemen. They have faced enemies across Europe. They know how battle works. They are confident in their skills, their weapons, their courage. And then they see something they do not understand. A pole being raised among the Skraeling ranks. Something attached to the top. Dark and round and somehow wrong. It does not look like any weapon they have ever seen. It does not look like anything from their world at all. The pole swings. The sphere flies through the air. It arcs over the Norse shields and lands among the defenders. And then the sound begins. What was that sound? This is where our investigation must proceed carefully, because we are trying to understand something that happened 1,000 years ago, described in sagas that were written down centuries after the events they describe. We are looking at shadows of shadows, trying to reconstruct reality from fragments of memory and imagination. Some historians have proposed that the weapon was a form of catapult ammunition. The Skraelings may have developed a simple throwing device that could hurl projectiles further than a human arm. The sphere itself might have been a stone wrapped in animal bladders or intestines, creating a container that would burst on impact and scatter its contents. But this explanation does not quite account for the terror it produced. Norse warriors were familiar with thrown weapons. They used them themselves. A stone, even a large one, even one that burst into fragments, would not have caused seasoned fighters to abandon their positions in panic. Other scholars have suggested that the weapon was primarily psychological. Perhaps the sphere contained something that produced a horrifying noise when it struck the ground. Some have proposed that it might have held angry bees or wasps, whose buzzing and stinging would have created chaos among defenders, not protected by the heavy clothing and face coverings that beekeepers use. The sound of thousands of enraged insects might indeed have seemed supernatural to men who had no framework for understanding it. There is another possibility that deserves consideration. Some researchers have wondered whether the Skraelings might have possessed some form of early explosive or incendiary device. Various indigenous peoples around the world developed sophisticated chemical knowledge, including the ability to create substances that burned fiercely or produced thick smoke. If the Skraeling weapon contained some kind of burning material that hissed and smoked and gave off choking fumes, it might explain why the Norse fled rather than standing their ground. You are drifting now, imagining these possibilities. The battlefield grows hazy in your mind. The sounds become distant. What matters is not the precise nature of the weapon, but what it represented. The Skraelings possessed knowledge that the Norse did not. They understood things about their world that the newcomers could not even imagine. And in that gap of understanding lay the seeds of Viking defeat. Let your breathing slow as we consider another aspect of this mystery. The saga accounts of the Skraeling attacks contain details that suggest careful planning and coordination. The natives did not simply rush at the Norse. in disorganized mobs. They chose their moments. They gathered their forces, he says. They attacked when they had the advantage of numbers and surprise. This level of tactical sophistication tells us something important about the peoples the Norse encountered. These were not primitive savages, whatever the Norse themselves may have thought. They were members of complex societies with their own military traditions, their own strategies, their own understanding of how to wage war effectively. Consider what we know about the indigenous peoples who lived in the regions the Norse explored. In what is now eastern Canada and the northeastern United States, various Algonquian-speaking peoples had lived for thousands of years. They had developed sophisticated hunting techniques that required coordination among many individuals. They had trading networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. They had social structures that allowed them to organize large groups for common purposes. When these peoples encountered the Norse, they would have assessed the newcomers carefully. They would have watched from concealment, studying the strangers, learning their patterns, identifying their weaknesses. And when they decided to act, they would have done so with all the skill and planning that their cultures could bring to bear. The Norse, by contrast, seem to have underestimated their opponents badly. Thorvald's unprovoked attack on the sleeping hunters shows a casual arrogance that would prove fatal. The Norse apparently assumed that their iron weapons and warrior traditions made them superior to any opponents they might encounter. They learned otherwise. Now let the scene shift. We are no longer on the battlefield. We are in the quiet aftermath, when the Norse survivors huddled in their settlement and tried to make sense of what had happened. The fire burns low. Men speak in hushed voices. Some are wounded. All are shaken. The confidence that carried them across the Atlantic has evaporated. What do you do when the world stops making sense? When the rules you have lived by suddenly no longer apply? The Norse had built their entire culture around the warrior ideal. Courage in battle was the highest virtue. Death in combat was the path to eternal glory in Valhalla. But none of that helped when you faced an enemy who fought in ways you could not understand, who used weapons you could not counter, who seemed to appear and disappear at will in a landscape that was utterly foreign. This is the true terror that the Skraelings represented. Not just their weapons or their numbers, but their otherness. They came from a world that the Norse could not comprehend. They operated by rules that the Norse could not learn. They were a living reminder that the universe was far larger and stranger than anything the sagas had prepared the Norsemen to expect. You feel that strangeness now, even across the distance of 1,000 years. The familiar world recedes. The comfortable certainties dissolve. There is only the darkness and the unknown pressing in from all sides. But wait, there is also warmth. There is also safety. You are not on that beach, facing an enemy you cannot understand. You are here now, in your own place of rest. The story is just a story. Words drifting through the darkness, like leaves on water. Let yourself be carried by them. Let yourself sink deeper into the comfort of the present moment. The Norse did not have that luxury. They had to decide what to do next. Stay and fight. Try to make peace. Abandon Vinland entirely. Each option carried terrible risks. Staying meant more attacks, more mysterious weapons, more deaths. Making peace meant trusting people whose intentions they could not read. Leaving meant admitting defeat. Returning to Greenland with nothing but tales of failure. In the end, as we have seen, they chose to leave. Thorfinn Karlsefni made the hard decision that would shape the rest of North American history. He gathered his people, loaded his ships, and sailed away from Vinland forever. The great experiment in Norse colonization was over. But the story does not end there, because even as the Norse withdrew from Vinland, they remained in Greenland. And in Greenland, they would face a different, but equally formidable challenge. The Thule people were coming, and they would prove to be even more terrifying than the Skraelings of Vinland. Let us turn our attention now to these northern hunters, these masters of the Arctic. Understanding who they were and how they lived will help us understand why the Norse feared them so deeply. The Thule culture emerged in Alaska around the year 1000, roughly the same time that Leif Erikson was making his voyages to Vinland. This is not a coincidence. Something was happening to the global climate during this period. Temperatures were warming slightly, opening up new hunting grounds and travel routes in the Arctic. Both the Norse and the Thule were expanding into these newly accessible regions. Their collision was perhaps inevitable. The Thule were whale hunters. This single fact explains much about their culture and their capabilities. Hunting whales from small boats in Arctic waters is one of the most dangerous and demanding activities that human beings have ever undertaken. It requires extraordinary skill, courage, and coordination. It requires boats that can survive encounters with animals, many times their size. It requires weapons that can pierce thick blubber and reach vital organs. And it requires a social organization that can bring together enough people to hunt, process, and distribute the massive quantities of food that a single whale provides. The Thule had developed all of these things. Their boats, their weapons, their social structures were all finely tuned for the challenges of Arctic whale hunting. And these same adaptations made them formidable in any conflict with outsiders. Consider the umiak, the large skin boat that the Thule used for whale hunting and transportation. An umiak could carry 10 or 20 people across open water. It was light enough to be carried over land when necessary. It was flexible enough to survive impacts that would have shattered a wooden vessel. And it was virtually silent, allowing hunters to approach their prey without warning. Now imagine facing a fleet of umiaks filled with warriors. They appear out of the Fisai, moving with uncanny coordination. They make no sound except the soft splash of paddles in water. They can go places your heavy wooden boat cannot reach. They can move faster than you can run. And they know this coastline, these waters, these weather patterns, in ways you never will. This is what the Norse in Greenland faced as the Thule expanded into their territory. Not a single battle, but a slow, relentless pressure that they could not resist. The Thule did not need to defeat the Norse in open combat. They simply needed to be better at surviving in the Arctic. And they were. They were so much better that there was never really any contest. Your eyelids grow heavy as you contemplate these patient hunters. There is no urgency in their approach. They have all the time in the world. They have been living in the Arctic for generations. They will be living there for generations more. The Norse are just a brief interruption, a curiosity that will soon be gone. Rest now. Let the waves rock you gently. The Thule are paddling their umiaks through the northern waters, but they mean you no harm. You are just a dreamer, drifting through a story that ended long ago. The outcome is already decided. The Norse have already lost. There is nothing left to fear, nothing left to struggle against. Only the slow unwinding of history, carrying you toward sleep. The Thule expansion into Greenland was not primarily military. It was ecological. They were simply better adapted to exploit the resources of the Arctic environment. Where the Norse depended on farming and livestock, the Thule depended on hunting. Where the Norse needed imported grain and iron, the Thule made everything they needed from the materials at hand. Where the Norse huddled in their stone houses during the long winter darkness, the Thule traveled freely across the ice, following the seals and caribou wherever they went. This adaptability was the Thule's greatest weapon. They did not need to fight the Norse, because they did not need anything the Norse had. They could simply wait while the harsh environment did their work for them. Every bad harvest, every failed hunting expedition, Every ship that did not arrive from Europe weakened the Norse colonies a little more. The Thule just had to be patient. And they were patient. Generations passed. The Norse population in Greenland slowly declined. The western settlement was abandoned sometime in the 1300s. The eastern settlement lasted longer, but grew weaker year by year. And all the while, the Thule were expanding, defeating, taking over territories that the Norse had once claimed as their own. There is something almost peaceful about this kind of defeat. Not the violence of battle, but the quiet yielding to forces beyond your control. The Norse in Greenland must have known on some level that they could not win. They must have watched the Thule hunters passing by and understood that these people belonged here in a way that they themselves never would. Let that understanding wash over you now. Some struggles cannot be won. Some forces cannot be resisted. There is wisdom in accepting this, in letting go of the need to fight and control. The night is deep. The story floats on. And you are floating, carried by currents older than any human memory. The archaeological evidence for contact between the Norse and the Thule is scattered but compelling. Objects have been found that suggest trade, conflict, or perhaps simply scavenging from abandoned sites. A piece of bronze that might have come from a Norse vessel. Fragments of chainmail, far from any known Norse settlement. Carved figures that some scholars believe show European-style faces and clothing. These artifacts are like messages from a time we can barely imagine. Two peoples, each with their own complete worldview, encountering each other at the edge of habitability. What did they think of each other? What stories did they tell? We can only guess, reconstructing possibilities from the fragments that have survived. You are holding one of those fragments now, in your dreaming mind. A small carved figure, worn smooth by centuries of handling. The face is strange, neither fully European nor fully Inuit. It might represent a Norse person, seen through Thule eyes, or it might represent something else entirely. A spirit, a character from a story, a memory of an encounter that changed everything. Turn the figure in your hands. Feel its weight, its smoothness, the years of human touch that have polished its surface. Someone made this long ago. Someone held it and wondered about the strangers who had come from across the sea. Someone tried to make sense of a world that was suddenly larger and stranger than they had ever imagined. The Thule had their own stories about the Norse. These stories survived in oral tradition and were eventually recorded by later European visitors. They speak of a people called the Kavlunayet, which was the Inuit term for European civilians. The Kavlunayet were described as a strange and somewhat foolish people who did not know how to live properly in the Arctic. They wore the wrong clothes, they ate the wrong foods, they built the wrong kind of houses. And eventually, they went away. There is a matter-of-fact quality to these stories that is somehow more chilling than any tale of battle. The Thule did not remember the Norse as great enemies or terrible monsters. They remembered them as people who simply could not adapt, who did not belong, who were bound to fail. The Kavlunayet came. The Kavlunayet struggled. The Kavlunayet left. That is all. Let that simplicity settle into your mind. Not every conflict is dramatic. Not every ending is violent. Sometimes things just fade away, quietly and slowly, until nothing remains but the faintest memory. The last certain evidence of the Norse in Greenland dates to 1408. After that, silence. European ships occasionally passed by the Greenland coast in the following decades, but they reported no signs of habitation. The Norse were gone. Where did they go? This question has fascinated historians for centuries. Various theories have been proposed. Some suggest that the remaining settlers tried to sail back to Iceland or Norway, but were lost at sea. Others proposed that they intermarried with the Thule and were absorbed into Inuit culture. Still others wonder if they migrated further south, disappearing into the vast forests of North America. The most likely answer is probably the simplest one. The population declined gradually as conditions worsened. Fewer children were born. More people died from cold, hunger, and disease. Some may have left on the rare ships that still visited. Others simply died where they lived, the last survivors of a community that had finally run out of hope. You can picture it now. A small settlement, perhaps only a few dozen people. The farms are failing. The livestock are thin and sickly. The ships from Europe no longer come. Each winter is a little harder than the last. Each spring brings a little less relief. And somewhere out there, beyond the hills, the Thule are thriving. Their camps are warm and well supplied. Their hunters bring in plenty of seals and walrus. Their children grow strong and healthy. They are not enemies exactly. They are not conquerors. They are simply the future, waiting patiently for the past to finish dying. There is no battle in this ending, no last stand, no heroic defeat, just the quiet extinguishing of a flame that had burned for 400 years. The Norse Greenland colonies flicker and go out, and the darkness that remains is the darkness that had always been there, waiting. Let that darkness comfort you now. It is not threatening. It is not cold. It is simply the natural state of things, the vast peaceful emptiness that exists beneath all our striving and struggling. The Norse fought against it for 4 centuries. The Thule learned to live within it. And now you are resting in it, floating in the gentle darkness between waking and sleep. The story continues, but you do not need to follow every word. Let the details wash over you. Let the names and dates blur together. What matters is the rhythm, the gentle rise and fall of the narrative, the soft tide of words carrying you further from shore. We should speak now about what the Norse feared most about the Skraelings. Not their weapons or their numbers, but something deeper, something that touched on the very foundations of Norse identity. The Norse were a people who valued understanding. Their iskas were attempts to make sense of the world, to impose narrative order on the chaos of experience. They named things obsessively, places and people and events, because naming something meant you understood it. You could control it. You could place it within the framework of meaning that structured your life. But the Skraelings could not be named in any way that made sense. They were utterly outside the Norse framework of understanding. Their languages were incomprehensible. Their customs were inexplicable. Their very existence challenged everything the Norse thought they knew about the world. In Norse mythology, the world was divided into 9 realms, connected by the great tree Yggdrasil. Humans lived in Midgard, the middle realm. Gods lived in Asgard. Giants lived in Jotunheim. Every being had its place in this cosmic structure. The universe made sense. But where did the Skraelings fit? They were clearly human, or at least human-like. But they came from a direction that was not part of the mythological map. They lived in lands that the gods had never mentioned. They practiced customs that no saga had ever described. They were, in a very real sense, impossible. This impossibility was terrifying in a way that mere physical danger could never be. A Norse warrior could face death calmly because he understood what death meant. He would go to Valhalla or hell, depending on how he died. His place in the cosmos was secure, but facing an enemy who existed outside the cosmos entirely, whose very being contradicted everything you believed about reality, that was something else. That was a confrontation with the unknown itself. You feel that confrontation now, but distantly, safely. The unknown is all around you, but it is not hostile. It is simply vast, endless, incomprehensible. Like the darkness behind your closed eyes. Like the space between thoughts. Like sleep itself. that mysterious country that you are slowly, gently entering. The Skraelings were not monsters. They were not demons. They were just people, living their lives, protecting their homes. But to the Norse, they represented something monstrous, simply by existing. They were proof that the world was larger than the sagas admitted. They were evidence that the gods did not tell the whole story. They were a crack in the foundation of everything the Norse believed. Perhaps that is the deepest reason why the Vikings retreated. Not because they could not defeat the Skraelings in battle, though that was true. Not because they were outnumbered, though that was also true. But because continuing to fight would have meant continuing to confront the impossibility of what they were seeing. Every day in Vinland was a day spent in the presence of the impossible. Every encounter with the Skraelings was a reminder that the world did not work the way the Norse had been taught. It was easier to leave, to sail back to Greenland, back to Iceland, back to the familiar shores of the known world, to tell the story of Vinland as a saga, contained and concluded, something that had happened and was now over, to file the experience away as a strange interlude rather than a permanent challenge to everything they believed. But the challenge remained. The crack in the foundation had been opened, and it would never fully close. Somewhere across the Western Ocean, there were people who had no place in the Norse universe. Somewhere out there, the impossible waited. Rest now. Let the impossible fade into the background. You do not need to resolve it. You do not need to understand it. Some things are simply beyond understanding, and that is all right. The darkness welcomes everything, the known and the unknown alike. It makes no distinctions. It asks no questions. It simply holds you, gently and completely, as you drift toward sleep. The waves rock the ship. The wind sighs through the rigging. The stars wheel overhead, familiar patterns that have guided sailors for generations. You are safe here, on the quiet waters between waking and drank. The Skraelings are far away. The battles are long over. There is only the night and the story and the slow, gentle pull of sleep. We will speak more of these matters as our journey continues. There are still mysteries to explore, still questions to consider, but there is no hurry. The night is long. The story will wait, and you are floating, carried by currents that know the way, even when you do not. Let your thoughts dissolve like morning mist. Let your body grow heavy and warm. The Norse retreated from Vinland, and the Thule watched them go, and the great forests stood silent along the empty shore. 1,000 years passed like the blinking of an eye, and now you are here, listening to the echo of those distant events, letting them lull you toward the peace that waits at the end of every story. Soon we will talk about what the archaeological record tells us. Soon we will examine the physical evidence that survives from those long-ago encounters. But not yet. For now, just rest. Just breathe. Just let the words carry you a little further into the dark. The fire has burned down to embers. The settlement is quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls at the moon. And under the overturned kayaks on the beach, the memories of the dead sleep their eternal sleep, waiting for a dawn that will never come. The site at Lons au Meadows remains the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America. It was discovered in 1960 by a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad. For years, scholars had debated whether the Vinland sagas described real events or mere fantasy. The Ingstads proved that the Vikings had indeed reached the New World, 5 centuries before Columbus set sail. You can visit Lons au Meadows today if you wish. It sits at the northern tip of Newfoundland, a windswept headland overlooking the Strait of Belle Isle. The original Norse structures are long gone, but reconstructions stand where they once stood. Low buildings made of turf and timber, built in the Icelandic style, a forge where iron was worked, a carpentry workshop, living quarters for perhaps 70 or 80 people. Imagine walking through those reconstructed buildings now. The ceiling is low. The air is thick with the smell of peat smoke. Small windows let in a dim gray light. This was home for the Norse who stayed here, however briefly. They slept in these rooms. They ate their meals by these fires. They looked out these windows at a landscape that was both beautiful and hostile. The archaeologists found many things at Lons aux Meadows. Iron rivets from boat repair, stone weights for fishing nets, a bronze ring-headed pin, the kind Norse women used to fasten their cloaks, a spindle whorl, proof that women were present and engaged in textile work. These small objects speak across the centuries, telling us about the daily lives of people whose names we will never know. But the archaeologists also found evidence of departure. The buildings were not destroyed. They were abandoned. The garbage pits were filled in carefully, as if the occupants expected to return someday. Everything suggests an orderly withdrawal, not a panicked flight. What made them leave? The sagas give us one answer: the conflicts with the Skraelings. But archaeology suggests other possibilities as well. The climate at Lons aux Meadows is harsh. The growing season is short. Farming would have been difficult, if not impossible. The Norse may have realized that Vinland, for all its resources, was simply too far from their supply chains to be sustainable. You are walking away from the settlement now, heading down to the rocky shore. The wind is cold. The waves crash against the rocks with a steady rhythm. Looking out across the gray water, you can almost see the ships departing, the sails filling with wind, the oars rising and falling. The faces of the settlers turned back toward the land they are leaving, wondering if they will ever see it again. They never did. Lons aux Meadows was occupied for perhaps 3 to 10 years. Then it was empty. The turf walls slowly collapsed. The wooden frames rotted away. Grass grew over the ruins, hiding them so completely that they lay undiscovered for 1,000 years. Let your walk along the shore slow to a gentle pace. The rocks are slippery with spray. The air tastes of salt. Somewhere overhead, seabirds wheel and cry. This is a liminal place, a boundary between worlds. The land ends here. The sea begins. And once, long ago, 2 branches of humanity met on this shore and could not find a way to share it. The indigenous peoples who lived in this region, when the Norse arrived, were probably ancestors of the Beothuk, an Algonquian-speaking people who would later become tragically famous as the first indigenous group in North America to be driven to complete extinction by European contact. The last known Beothuk, a woman named Shanaudithit, died in 1829. There is a terrible irony here. The Beothuk, or their ancestors, successfully drove away the first European invaders. They maintained their independence for 5 centuries after the Norse retreat. But when the second wave of Europeans came, armed with guns and diseases and an insatiable hunger for land, the Beothuk could not hold them back. By the early 19th century, they were gone. Perhaps the Norse defeat was only a postponement. Perhaps the Skraeling victory was only temporary. History seems to move in one direction, toward European dominance of the Americas, and nothing the indigenous peoples did could ultimately stop that movement. But for 500 years, they had held the line. For 500 years, North America had remained theirs. That is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. Whatever came later, the peoples of North America won a victory that deserves to be celebrated. They faced the mightiest warriors of medieval Europe and turned them back. They proved that their lands could be defended, that their ways of life were worth fighting for, that the invasion was not inevitable. You are tired now. Your walk along the shore has worn you out. Find a sheltered spot among the rocks and sit down. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts settle like sediment in still water. The story continues, but it asks less and less of you. Just listen. Just rest. Just let the words wash over you like waves on sand. The Norse left behind more than buildings and artifacts at Lance o Meadows. They left behind questions that we are still trying to answer. How far south did they explore? Did they establish other settlements that have not yet been discovered? Did they have contacts with native peoples beyond the Skraelings described in the sagas? Some scholars believe that the Norse ventured much further into North America than Lance o Meadows suggests. References in the sagas to wild grapes and self-sown wheat have led some to propose that Vinland proper was located somewhere south of Newfoundland, perhaps in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, perhaps as far as New England. If this is true, the Norse may have encountered many different native groups, each with their own response to the strange visitors from the sea. There are tantalizing hints in the archaeological record. Norse artifacts, or objects that might be Norse artifacts, have been found at sites scattered across northeastern North America. A coin minted in Norway during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, struck between 1065 and 1080, was found at a native site in Maine. How did it get there? Trade, raid, gift? We do not know. A small stone with what might be runic inscriptions was found in Minnesota in 1898. This is the famous Kensington runestone, and it has been the subject of furious debate ever since its discovery. Most scholars believe it is a modern forgery, but a few continue to argue for its authenticity. If real, it would indicate that the Norse penetrated deep into the continental interior. If fake, it tells us more about 19th century imagination than about medieval exploration. You do not need to resolve these debates. You do not need to decide what is real and what is false. Let the possibilities float in your mind like bubbles in water. Norse explorers paddling up unknown rivers, native peoples watching from the shadows, stone markers carved and forgotten, coins changing hands across cultural boundaries. The past is full of things we will never know for certain, and that uncertainty is not a problem to be solved. It is simply the nature of history, the long, slow fading of memory into mystery. The wind has died down now. The shore is quiet, except for the gentle lapping of waves. The sun is setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink and purple. This is the golden hour, the time between day and night, the threshold between waking and sleep. Rest in this threshold space. You do not need to cross over yet. You do not need to decide anything. Just exist here, suspended between states, held gently by the fading light. The Norse explorers must have seen sunsets like this one, standing on shores they would soon abandon. They must have felt the beauty and the strangeness of this new world, even as they prepared to leave it. They had come so far. They had risked so much, and in the end, they could not stay. But they had been here. That much is certain. They had walked on these beaches, looked at these skies, breathed this air. For a brief moment, 1,000 years ago, the old world and the new had touched. And even though the connection did not last, even though the Norse withdrew and the Skraelings reclaimed their lands, something had changed. The world had grown larger. The boundaries of the possible had expanded. The first step on a long journey had been taken. 500 years later, other Europeans would follow that step day, and everything would change. But that is a story for another time. Tonight we stay with the Norse, with their brief, bright venture into the unknown, with their terror and their courage and their ultimate defeat. The light fades. The first stars appear. You are drifting now, carried by currents deeper than thought. The story continues, but you can barely hear it. The words blend together into a soft murmur, a gentle hum, a lullaby sung by the sea itself. Sleep now. The Vikings are sailing home. The Skraelings are returning to their villages. The great forests of Vinland stand silent under the rising moon. And you are safe, held by the night, floating toward dreams. The relationship between the Norse and the indigenous peoples of North America was not always violent. The sagas contain accounts of peaceful trade alongside the stories of conflict. The Skraelings came to the Norse settlements with furs to exchange. The Norse offered milk, cloth, and small metal items in return. For a time, it seemed like coexistence might be possible. These trading encounters offer a glimpse of what might have been. Two peoples, each with something the other wanted, finding ways to communicate across the vast gulf of language and culture. The Skraelings prized Norse textiles, particularly red cloth, which they apparently valued highly. The Norse were eager for the valuable furs that the natives could provide. There was a basis for mutual benefit, a foundation on which something lasting might have been built. But the foundation was never solid. The Norse could not stop seeing the Skraelings as inferior, as obstacles, as threats. The saga tells us that Thorfinn Karlsefni forbade his men from selling swords or other weapons to the natives, fearing that armed Skraelings would become even more dangerous. This was probably wise from a military standpoint, but it revealed the underlying attitude. The Norse were not looking for partners. They were looking for subjects. And the Skraelings, for their part, could not ignore what had happened on that beach when Thorvald's men killed the sleeping hunters. Trust once broken is difficult to rebuild. The natives may have continued trading out of curiosity or self-interest, but they never forgot that these strangers were capable of unprovoked murder. They watched. They waited. They prepared. You can feel the tension building, even in these peaceful moments. Two sides facing each other across a makeshift market. Furs changing hands. Red cloth being examined and admired. But beneath the surface, calm, fear, and suspicion churning. Each side wondering when the other will strike. Each side ready to flee or fight at the first sign of trouble. The bull incident shattered whatever fragile peace existed. We talked about this earlier. The great bull charging out of the woods, terrifying the Skraelings into flight. To the Norse, it was probably amusing. A startled cow had scared away the natives. How timid these Skraelings must be. But the Skraelings did not see it that way. They saw a monstrous beast, unlike anything in their experience, emerging from the direction of the Norse settlement. They interpreted it as an attack, perhaps a supernatural one. The trust they had tentatively extended was betrayed. From that moment on, war was inevitable. Let the tension drain from your body as you consider these ancient misunderstandings. You are not part of this conflict. You are only an observer, watching from a great distance. The fear and anger of 1,000 years ago cannot touch you now. It is just a story, just words, just the echo of something that happened and ended long before you were born. The final attack on the Norse settlement was overwhelming. The sagas speak of vast numbers of Skraelings, more than anyone had ever seen before. They came by sea and by land. They carried their mysterious weapon, the dark sphere on a pole that made such terrible sounds. They were done with trading. They were done with waiting. They wanted the strangers gone. And the strangers fled. The mighty Vikings, who had never retreated from any enemy in Europe, ran into the forests like frightened children. Only Freda stood her ground, and even her courage could not change the outcome. The settlement was lost. The dream of Vinland was over. Picture the aftermath now. The Norse ships pulling away from shore, overloaded with refugees. The Skraelings watching from the beach, making no move to pursue Sioux. They have won. They do not need to do anything more. The strangers are leaving, and they will not return. On the departing ships, the settlers look back at the land they are abandoning. Some are wounded. Some are grieving for those who did not make it. All are shaken. their confidence in Norse superiority destroyed. They came to conquer a new world and discovered that the new world did not want them. The voyage back to Greenland must have been faber. Days and weeks of sailing through gray northern waters, with plenty of time to reflect on what had gone wrong. They had the resources of a mighty Viking culture behind them. They had ships, weapons, experience in warfare and colonization. And yet they had failed. Some of the settlers probably blamed the Skraelings, calling them treacherous, savage, inhuman. That is the way of defeated peoples everywhere. It is easier to demonize your enemies than to admit that they simply outfought you. The sagas preserve some of this attitude, referring to the Skraelings in disparaging terms, even while acknowledging their military success. But some of the wiser settlers might have drawn different conclusions. They might have recognized that the Skraelings were not savages, but sophisticated peoples defending their homeland. They might have understood that Norse tactics, so effective in Europe, were not suited to this new environment. They might have begun to see that the world was larger and more complex than their sagas had taught them. Let wisdom settle into your thoughts like snow settling on a winter landscape. The Norse learned hard lessons in Vinland, lessons about the limits of power and the dangers of arrogance. Those lessons cost lives. They caused suffering. But they were real, and they mattered. You are very tired now. The story has been long. The night has grown deep. Let yourself drift further toward sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of words that ask nothing of you except to listen. The ships reach Greenland. The survivors disembark. They are home, or as close to home as any Norse settlement in the far North Atlantic can be. The families who stayed behind crowd around, eager for news of Vinland. What is it like? Why are you back so soon? What happened to the others? The stories are told. The dead are mourned. Life goes on. The business of survival in a harsh land leaves little time for dwelling on past failures. Sheep must be tended. Fish must be caught. Houses must be repaired before winter comes. Vinland becomes a memory, then a legend, then just a word in old sagas that children learn and adults half remember. But the Skraelings do not become a memory, because even as Vinland fades into myth, the Thule are expanding southward along the Greenland coast. The terror that drove the Norse from Vinland is about to arrive at their doorstep. There will be no escape this time. There is nowhere else to sail. The coming encounter between the Greenland Norse and the Thules will be slower than the Vinland conflicts, but ultimately more decisive. It will play out over centuries rather than years. It will involve not dramatic battles, but the quiet pressure of competition for resources in a harsh land. And it will end with the complete disappearance of the Norse from Greenland, one of the great mysteries of medieval history. But that story can wait. For now, rest. Let the ships of memory carry you toward the harbor of sleep. The Norse are home in Greenland, nursing their wounds, telling their tales, trying to make sense of what they experienced. The Skraelings of Vinland are resuming their lives. The strange interlude of Norse contact, already fading into stories their grandchildren will barely believe. And the Thule are paddling their kayaks south, following the seals and the whales, drawing ever closer to the settlements, where the Norse sit unaware of what is coming. Everything ends. Everything changes. The Norse will vanish from Greenland, just as they vanished from Vinland. The Thule will become the Inuit, and the Inuit will endure. The great wheel of history turns, and all our strivings are just ripples on the surface of time. Rest in that knowledge. Let it comfort you. Your struggles too will pass. Your worries too will fade. In 1,000 years, everything you know will be as distant and strange as the battles of Vinland are to us now, and that is all right. That is how it should be. We are all just travelers, passing through on our way somewhere else. The fire burns low. The stories end. The long night deepens toward its darkest hour, and somewhere in the world beyond your window, the descendants of all these peoples are living their lives, unaware that you are thinking of their ancestors, unaware that a dreamer in the darkness is holding their history in their drowsing mind. Sleep now. Let go now. The story is almost over, but the peace that follows lasts forever. We come now to the final chapters of Norse Greenland, and we must speak of endings. Not sudden endings, not dramatic conclusions, but the slow fading of a light that had burned for 4 centuries. This is a gentle story in its way. There are no great battles left to describe, only the quiet accumulation of pressures that finally became too much to bear. The Greenland settlements had always been precarious. They existed at the very edge of what was possible for medieval European agriculture. The growing season was short. The winters were brutal. Every year was a gamble, a question of whether the hay would last, whether the animals would survive, whether enough food could be stored to carry the community through to spring. For a long time, the gamble paid off. The Norse in Greenland developed a way of life adapted to their harsh environment. They supplemented their farming with hunting and fishing. They traded walrus ivory to European merchants in exchange for iron, grain, and other necessities. They built sturdy stone churches and held on to their Christian faith, even at the edge of the world. But the balance was always delicate. A few bad years in a row could mean disaster. A change in climate, even a slight one, could tip the scales from sustainability to collapse. And the climate was changing. The medieval warm period, which had made Norse expansion into the North Atlantic possible, was giving way to the Little Ice Age. Temperatures were dropping. Sea ice was increasing. The already short growing season was getting shorter. The harvests that had been adequate were becoming insufficient. You can feel the cold settling in now. Not the bitter cold of a winter night, but the slow creeping cold of centuries. Each decade a little harder than the last. Each generation a little more worn down by the struggle. The warmth that your ancestors knew, becoming a fading memory, replaced by an endless chill that seeps into everything. The Norse tried to adapt. Archaeological evidence shows that their diet shifted over time, relying more heavily on seal meat and less on the products of their farms. They were becoming more like the Skraelings they had once looked down on, more like hunters than farmers. But they could not complete the transformation. Their culture, their identity, their whole way of life was built around the European model of settled agriculture. They could not simply become Thule. And the Thule kept coming. Each year they pushed a little further south. Each year their hunting camps appeared in places that had once been exclusively Norse. They were not hostile, for the most part. They did not need to be. They were simply better at living in this land. They could thrive where the Norse could barely survive. Picture a Norse farmer standing on a hillside, looking out at the fjord below. His grandfather built this farm. His father worked this land. He has spent his whole life here, and so will his children, if he can manage to raise any to adulthood. But the Thule kayaks are becoming more common in the waters. The Thule camps are appearing closer and closer. And he knows, deep in his bones, that his way of life is ending. What do you do with that knowledge? How do you face the extinction of everything you love? The Norse had no answer to these questions. They simply kept going, year after year, doing what they had always done, hoping that somehow things would get better. They did not get better. The western settlement was abandoned sometime in the 1300s. When a ship from the eastern settlement visited to check on their neighbors, they found only empty farms. The cattle had gone wild. The buildings were falling into ruin. There was no sign of what had happened to the people. The eastern settlement lasted longer, but it too was dying. The population declined. The churches fell empty. The trading ships from Europe came less and less frequently. By the early 1400s, the Greenland Norse were almost completely cut off from the rest of the world. And then they were gone. The last records date to 1408. After that, nothing. When European explorers returned to Greenland in the 16 and 1700s, they found only Inuit inhabitants. The Norse had vanished so completely that some people doubted they had ever existed at all. Let the mystery of their disappearance rest easy in your mind. We do not need to solve it tonight. Perhaps they died of plague or famine. Perhaps they sailed away to Iceland and were lost at sea. Perhaps they intermarried with the Thule, and their descendants live on in modern Inuit populations. Perhaps some combination of all these things occurred. What matters is that they are gone, and the Thule remain. The people who terrified the Vikings, who drove them from Vinland, who outcompeted them in Greenland, are still here. Their descendants still live in the Arctic. Their culture still thrives in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They won. There is a lesson here if you want to find one. The strongest do not always triumph. The most technologically advanced do not always prevail. Sometimes the people who win are simply the ones who belong, who fit their environment so well that no outsiders can dislodge them. The Thule belonged to the Arctic. The Norse did not. All the swords and ships and sagas in the world could not change that fundamental fact. And so the Norse passed into history, and the Thule endured, and the ice continued its slow advance across the northern world. Rest now in the knowledge of that endurance. The Thule did not need to be warriors to defeat the Vikings. They only needed to be themselves, to live their lives, to continue doing what they had always done. The victory came not through violence, but through persistence, through simply refusing to go away. You can find that kind of persistence within yourself. The strength to endure, the patience to outlast your troubles, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are and where you belong. The Thule had it. The Norse did not. And that made all the difference. The hour grows late. The story nears its end. Let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of waves on a distant shore. Let your thoughts dissolve into the peaceful darkness that surrounds you. The Norse are gone. The Thule remain. And you are here now. In this moment that belongs only to you. We have traveled far tonight, across oceans and centuries, through battles and retreats, through hope and fear and final endings. Now we come to the place where all journeys end, the quiet harbor, where the ships rest and the sailors sleep. What have we learned from this long tale? What wisdom can we carry forward into our own lives? Perhaps the most important lesson is simply this. Courage is not always enough. The Norse had courage in abundance. They sailed into unknown seas, faced terrifying enemies, risked everything on the chance of finding new lands. But courage alone could not make Vinland theirs. Courage alone could not save them from the slow decline of Greenland. The Skrælings and the Thule had something the Norse lacked. They had belonging. They were part of their environment in a way the Norse could never be. Their knowledge, their skills, their very bodies had been shaped by thousands of years of adaptation to these lands. The Norse were visitors, however long they stayed. The indigenous peoples were home. There is a deep comfort in belonging, in knowing that you are where you are supposed to be, in feeling the land beneath your feet and recognizing it as yours. The Norse sought that belonging in Vinland and Greenland, but they could never fully achieve it. They have remained forever strangers, forever out of place, forever struggling against an environment that did not want them. You are not struggling now. You are at rest. You have found, for this moment at least, a place where you belong. The bed beneath you, the darkness around you, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. This is your place. This is your time. Let yourself sink into it. completely. The Vikings were remarkable people. Their achievements were real and worthy of respect. They explored further than any Europeans before them. They established settlements in places that seemed impossible. They left their mark on the history of the world. But they were not invincible. They had their limits. And in the far north and the distant west, they found those limits. Perhaps that is the most human thing about them. Not their victories, but their defeats. Not their triumphs, but their failures. We all have limits. We all encounter forces we cannot overcome. The Norse encountered theirs in the form of the Skrælings and the Thule, and they responded by doing the best they could, which was sometimes not good enough. That is all any of us can do. Try our best. Accept our limits. Find grace in the face of forces beyond our control. The Norse did not find that grace, not really. They fought and struggled and resisted to the end. But perhaps we can find it, learning from their example. Perhaps we can accept that some things cannot be conquered. Some battles cannot be won. Some destinies cannot be changed. The night is very deep now. The hour is very late. You are floating in a sea of darkness, held gently by the currents of sleep. The story has done its work. The words have carried you far from the shores of waking. Now it is time to let go, to release, to drift. The last Norse settlers in Greenland must have known moments of peace, even at the end. A sunset over the fjord, a child's laughter, the warmth of a fire on a cold night. Life does not stop being beautiful just because it is ending. Sometimes the ending makes the beauty more precious, more vivid, more real. You can find that beauty now, in the darkness behind your closed eyes, in the silence between thoughts, in the vast, peaceful emptiness that underlies all experience. It is always there, waiting for you, whenever you choose to notice it. The Vikings searched for beauty too, in their way. They found it in the curl of a wave, the flight of a raven, the gleam of gold in a dragon's hoard. They sang of it in their sagas, painted it on their shields, carved it into the prows of their ships. Beauty was part of what drove them across the seas, seeking new horizons, new wonders, new worlds to discover. They found wonders in Vinland, forests that seemed to go on forever, rivers teeming with fish, wild grapes hanging from the vines, a land of abundance beyond anything they had known in the harsh north. For a brief moment, it must have seemed like paradise. But paradise had its guardians. The Skrælings watched from the forest's edge. The mysterious weapons waited in the shadows. The price of paradise was blood, and the Norse discovered they were not willing to pay it. So they left the beauty behind and sailed back to their harsher, safer homes. Perhaps that is always the way. We glimpse paradise but cannot stay. We taste perfection but cannot hold it. The moment passes, the vision fades, and we are left with only the memory of what we saw. But the memory is enough. The memory sustains us. The memory reminds us that beauty exists, even if we cannot possess it. Rest now in the memory of beauty. The wild grapes of Vinland, the northern lights over Greenland, the endless sea beneath the dragon-prowed ships. These things existed once. These things were real. And in your dreaming mind, they can exist again, as vivid and true as if you were seeing them for the first time. The story ends. The ships have all come home. The battles are all over. The Norse have passed into history, and the Thule have inherited the North. And the great wheel of time continues its slow turning through the centuries. But you are still here, breathing, resting, live. The story was about people long dead, but you are not among them. You have your own story, your own journey, your own seas yet to sail. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to discover who you are and what you can become. For now, though, there is only rest. Only peace, only the gentle embrace of sleep, waiting to carry you away to dreams. Let yourself go. Let yourself fall. The darkness will catch you. The silence will hold you. And when you wake, the world will be new again, full of possibility, ready for whatever adventure comes next. Sleep well. Dream deep. The Vikings are with you now, sailing through the darkness of your unconscious mind, carrying you toward the morning that waits on the other side of night. And so we come at last to the end of our journey. 2 hours we have traveled together across the cold Atlantic, through the forests of Vinland, along the icy shores of Greenland. We have met warriors and hunters, farmers and explorers, peoples whose names we know, and peoples whose names are lost to time. We have witnessed courage and fear, triumph and defeat, the beginning of things and the ending of things. Now there is only the quiet, the gentle darkness, the soft sound of your own breathing. The story is complete. The teller has no more to tell. All that remains is the peace that comes after words, the silence that follows every tile. You may already be asleep. If so, these words are falling into your dreams like snowflakes into deep water, dissolving into the vast quiet of your unconscious mind. They will leave traces, perhaps, memories that surface unexpectedly, images of longships and kayaks, of axes and arrows, of people standing on distant shores, looking out at worlds they barely understood. If you are still awake, let these final words carry you the last short distance to sleep. There is nothing left to learn, nothing left to discover. The mysteries of Vinland will keep their secrets. The fate of the Greenland Norse will remain uncertain. Some questions have no answers, and that is part of what makes them beautiful. The Thule people, whom the Norse feared so deeply, are still with us. Their descendants, the Inuit, continue to live in the Arctic regions of Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. They have survived colonization, disease, cultural disruption, and climate change. They have adapted and endured, just as their ancestors did when they first encountered the strange men in the wooden ships. There is hope in that continuity. The line that stretches from the whale hunters of 1,000 years ago to the people living in the Arctic today is unbroken. The knowledge that allowed the Thule to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth has been passed down through countless generations. The victory over the Vikings was not just a moment in time. It was the beginning of a survival that continues to this day. You too are part of an unbroken line, stretching back through your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, back through centuries and millennia, all the way to the first humans who walked the earth. You carry within you the accumulated wisdom of all those generations, the courage they showed, the love they felt, the dreams they dreamed. It is all there, coded into your very being, a heritage more precious than any treasure. Rest now in that heritage. Let it support you. Let it remind you that you are not alone, that you have never been alone, that you are connected to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. The great web of human existence holds you gently, as it has held all the people we have spoken of tonight, as it will hold all the people whose stories are yet to be told. The fire has burned to ash. The last embers glow faintly in the darkness. Outside, the stars wheel slowly through their ancient patterns. Inside, your breath rises and falls, the most natural rhythm in the world. I wonder sometimes what the last Norse settler in Greenland thought on their final night in that dying colony. Did they know it was the end? Did they understand that their world was passing away? Or did they simply go to sleep, as they had done countless times before, expecting to wake to another day of struggle and survival? We will never know. The silence of history swallows such intimate moments. But I like to think they found some peace, even at the end. I like to think they looked up at the same stars we see tonight and felt some connection to the vast universe that contained them. I like to think they were not afraid. You need not be afraid either. Whatever tomorrow brings, whatever challenges await, whatever endings approach, you can meet them with the same courage that carried the Norse across unknown seas. You can face them with the same patience that allowed the Thule to outlast their enemies. You can embrace them with the same acceptance that comes from understanding that all things pass, all things change, all things eventually find their rest. The night is almost over. Dawn waits somewhere beyond the horizon, as it always does, as it always will. But for now, there is only darkness, only peace, only the deep stillness that precedes all awakening. Let yourself sink into that stillness. Let it fill every part of you. The story has ended, but you continue. The words have faded, but you remain. And in the morning, when the light returns and the world begins again, you will rise to meet it, rested and renewed, ready for whatever comes. Sleep now. Sleep deep and long and well. The Vikings have sailed home. The Thule have returned to their camps. The great forests of Vinland stand silent under the stars. And you dreamer, you listener, you traveler, through the long hours of the night, you have finally arrived. This is the harbor. This is the home. This is the place where all journeys end and all stories find their rest. Welcome. You are safe now. You are home now. You are at peace. Sleep. Sweet dreams.